Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and joining me this week we have Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spike columnist Inaya Folarin Iman.
Hi.
Coming up on today's show, Ukraine 1 year on, the rewriting of Roald Dahl, and the SNP leadership race. So, on the 24th of February, a year ago, Russia did the unthinkable and invaded Ukraine, a sovereign nation at the heart of Europe. This week, this anniversary has been marked by a surprise visit to Kiev by Joe Biden and by Vladimir Putin, who gave a rambling 2-hour speech blaming the West for the war. Tom, before we talk about the more current events, should we cast our minds back to the very beginning? Because this was not only was the invasion unexpected, but the fight back was pretty unexpected too.
No, I think that's exactly it. I mean, first the invasion shocked the world, and then the resistance shocked the world. Obviously, the US intelligence services get a lot of undue credit in some respects over the course of this conflict because of the fact that they were saying this is definitely going to happen, even in the face of a lot of skepticism from the commentariat or even from a lot of people in Ukraine themselves. One prediction that really didn't pan out was what General Mark Milley reportedly said in the run-up to the invasion or in the immediate aftermath of it, I'm not sure which, that Kiev could have effectively fall within 72 hours.
Yeah.
And that this is why, reportedly, Zelensky was offered a way out in which he utters that potentially apocryphal line that he needed ammunition rather than a ride and so on. I think that's worth sort of noting because obviously it's quite clear that Vladimir Putin completely recognized the strength of kind of Ukrainian nationhood, Ukrainian resolve, and so on. But even the West did as well. I think that was one of the things that after the shock of the invasion, the shock of the resistance was really there. And I think this is often talked about in terms of bravery, which of course it is, the incredible heroism that we've seen, not just from the armed forces themselves, but even everyday citizens. You remember kind of in those early days, even whether it was the guys on Snake Island telling the Moskva to go fuck themselves, or whether it was the old lady saying to the Russian soldier, put these sunflower seeds in your pocket, so at least when you die, something will grow out of it. But also I think one thing that's undervalued is also the fact that where that strength is drawn from, where that courage is drawn from, is the fact that for all the talk from Putin or anyone else that Ukraine is a kind of bullshit nation, that it was at least a sizable chunk of it was going to welcome or if not roll over in the face of this invasion, that there was that base of national fellow feeling, solidarity and resolve to repel this invasion. I think that was the thing that continues to inspire people, but it's worth remembering how it wasn't necessarily counted on, particularly by the Western powers when this all kicked off.
I mean, that kind of gives the lie to this narrative that the West is behind it all, that the West is pulling the strings, because really the West didn't actually have a clue what was going to happen.
And there was also Biden talking about minor incursions.
Yeah, just
maybe being tolerated earlier on. So.
Yeah, but Biden sort of flip-flopped from saying, prior to the war that, Russia, Vladimir Putin will not remain president while I'm president, and then saying, yes, we'll tolerate a minor incursion into Ukraine.
Yeah.
So there was that level of confusion.
Yeah, and on top, I mean, the West's response hasn't been perfect, but I think many people assumed because of the response to Crimea that they weren't really going to do anything. So in that sense, that challenged perceptions also. But just on the point that you said about the West pulling the strings, well, actually, there's been at many points quite a confused response and a disoriented response, particularly on the continent, because of Europe's dependence on Russia for energy supplies. So I think the narrative that the West are kind of pulling the strings is again just a attempt to avoid the reality of the conflict.
Yeah, definitely. And talking about that kind of, I guess, that sort of lack of Western unity. I mean, obviously, everyone in the West pretty much supports Ukraine, but we can't necessarily agree how to support them. Mm-hmm. And in recent months, the debate has been over offensive weapons, over whether do we send tanks. The debate's sort of moving on to do we send fighter jets. I mean, Tom, what have you made of that kind of discussion? Because it has seemed slightly a level removed from the conflict in some ways.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, it just gives the lie to the idea that there was this kind of unified Western response. I think there's a sort of tendency and a desire really for Western unity, Western purpose, Western self-confidence to be just automatically rejuvenated by this particular conflict, the West's support of Ukraine in it. But at the same time, it has showed a lot of the cracks at the same time, as well as one thing that's often neglected as well is the broader international picture. There's not a lot of time spent thinking about, or at least not nearly enough in kind of Western commentary circles about the fact that there are large parts of the world, the majority of the world really, which is even neutral or in some cases actually pro-Russia. And the lack of grasping of that nettle, I think, has been quite striking. But so many people have been kind of discombobulated by this conflict. I think that's fair to say in a way. That's not unsurprising, but it has been striking to me how it's kind of shown up, whether it was the latent hypocrisies or it's just scrambled the brains of people who previously claimed to be quite principled in some of these particular issues. So one of which you had the sort of populist right, particularly in America, people who are constantly talking about national sovereignty, and concerns about borders and so on, remarkably relaxed about this, violent incursion into sovereign nations' borders. And then, of course, you had the kind of anti-imperial left who did at certain points become kind of like apologists for Russian imperialism. They're kind of so preoccupied, were they, with the genuine folly of Western foreign policy over recent decades and so on, that they kind of ascribe Russia no agency whatsoever. And also in other situations kind of would almost, in their kind of arguments, would almost kind of make apologies for the idea of great power paternalism, that, you're getting into Russia's sphere of influence. How dare you? America wouldn't tolerate this, so why should Russia? So in so many different ways, I think it scrambled people's brains and showed up the kind of cracks that had already potentially existed. But I think part of that, as much as anything else, is testament to what a profound shock to the system this conflict was, particularly in the supposedly post-conflict end of history era that we were allegedly living in.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of alludes to the way that it was quite quickly fed, or actually it took fairly long, but it was, part of the culture war, and people couldn't see it as a distinct issue. So you will have people suddenly, where you stand on Zelensky seems to have very little to do with, your actual, what he's done. It's, are you on the right side of history or the bad side of history? Do you see him as corrupt? Do you see him as a saint?
And at some points it's got pretty nasty. I mean, some people, I think in the early days in particular, they've quieted down quite substantially, but almost suggesting that Putin was a kind of anti-woke figure against the bulwark of moral degradation in the West. And I mean, it just really just illuminates the moral confusion of many political ideologies at the moment, that you can make that kind of comparison.
Yeah, and we should talk a bit about the sort of Russia question as well, because obviously there have been lots of sanctions against Russia. Some in America probably would like to see a total humiliating defeat of Russia. But even that aspect has been sort of dragged into the culture wars, where we've had these cancellation of Russian artists, Russian plays, Russian composers. I mean, do you want to remind us a bit about that, Tom?
Yeah, it's easy to forget about it, partly because it was quite a while away now, but also probably because a lot of these slightly Russophobic tendencies have been sort of quietly internalised now. But there was that really shocking period in which, what was it, like the Cardiff Philharmonic cancelling Tchaikovsky, because obviously he is ultimately to blame for this particular conflict, apparently. Russian sports people, youth, pianist child prodigies being stopped from playing. There was a Russian film in a Scottish, I believe, film festival which was cancelled, and you saw this all too predictable but regrettable kind of response, which was to treat all Russian citizens as effectively, guilty for the crimes of their state. Something that which we really shouldn't do that in any circumstance. Although there's a fair few countries around the world we do tend to do that with these days, and also seem to be playing naturally into the Russian state's narrative, which is to say this isn't because the West supports Ukraine in its fight for self-determination or whatever that is. It's purely because they hate Russia, they want to take us down, they hate you, and it can only help but vindicate that particular perspective, and that's one of the things that's been deeply regrettable, is that it almost feels like those kinds of boycotts, that kind of illiberal cultural response is just sort of baked in now.
Yeah.
And it was very difficult to challenge at the time. As pro-Ukraine as you wanted to be, if you said it's Russophobic and gross that you're talking about either expelling Russian citizens en masse or stopping them playing at concert halls and so on, it was a very unpopular position in sort of commentariat when that happened.
One thing the West has done for Ukraine is welcome a lot of refugees. That seems to be completely uncontroversial. That seems to have skipped past the kind of usual debates about immigration that we have. I mean, do you think that's a sign of, genuine solidarity?
Oh, absolutely. And actually the support remains consistently high. And I think this isn't necessarily about the British people, but I do think it does demonstrate that the British people aren't just rampant anti-immigration, that they actually have a nuanced position, are able to judge what is the right instance and so on. And I think that that's been a really positive demonstration, not just in the UK, but also in Hungary and Poland, of ordinary people opening their arms and welcoming and showing that solidarity that is not always the opportunity to do so.
And some people have taken this even a step further by going out to fight. I think a lot of people, maybe the mainstream press, have been actually fairly condemnatory of this, talking about it as reckless. But isn't it just a serious sign of solidarity?
I mean, there's nothing more inspiring than that. These individuals who have taken this fight as their own. There's many people who also, I mean, this is what real internationalism looks like. It's not about putting a Ukraine flag in your Twitter bio. It's not about sharing the right hashtags, putting your life on the line for principles that you think are important and showing that level of solidarity with people of a different country who are facing this kind of invasion is incredible. The amount of people as well, incidentally, who are veterans of, say, fighting with the Kurds in Syria, who have then gone out to Ukraine, people like Mesa Gifford, friend of the show, who's been on before, who is out there fighting at the moment. Sean Pinner and Aidan Aslin, who were the two very high-profile UK fighters, prisoners of war captured by Russia, were, in both cases, I think, again, veterans of battles in Syria against Islamic State and so on. And it's just been unfortunate for obvious reasons. People want to chide the government for, there was that brief moment where Liz Truss as Foreign Secretary almost seems to be encouraging this. That's obviously something that it's very difficult for a government to do for obvious reasons. And obviously that became another opportunity to bash the government, which many people leapt on. But still, I don't think that should detract from how inspiring this is. You might not want to encourage your sons and daughters to do it, but we should still be in awe of people who are prepared to make that kind of step.
And finally, I mean, what ultimately, Inaya, what is at stake here is national sovereignty. And do you think that's something that people will realise that they've probably neglected over the years as an important value?
And I remember when Boris Johnson had made that comparison somewhat, and there was people saying, well, how could you make that comparison?
He's talking about Brexit.
And, obviously it's completely different situations, but I think we agree when it comes to the Ukraine conflict that actually national sovereignty isn't just, the calls for it isn't just a rhetorical device, is actually something meaningful, substantive, worth fighting for, and in some cases worth dying for in many cases. And I think that does give a renewed meaning to the importance in the context of the conversations that we've been having over the last few years. And so whilst I think for us, it's important and a reminder, but whether or not that recognition is going to actually be made in the places that it needs to be made about the importance of national sovereignty, I think is still an ongoing debate.
I mean, we all know that our broadband providers, the government, advertisers and big tech are constantly trying to snoop on our online activity. But thanks to ExpressVPN, I'm protected from all of that. Seriously, I mean, using the internet without ExpressVPN, it's a bit like making a phone call on speakerphone in the middle of a crowded bus. I mean, it's just risky, and you really never know who might be listening into your private details. You just don't have to be that person. The reason I use ExpressVPN is really simple. Internet service providers keep track of every website you visit, and in some countries, like the US, they can even legally sell your data to advertisers or to the tech giants. But with ExpressVPN, your online activity stays completely private. That's thanks to the secure encrypted tunnel it creates between your device and the internet. The best part is that it's really, really easy to use. You just open up the app, you click one button. It works on your phone, your laptop, and even on your router, so everyone on your Wi-Fi network can stay protected. So don't wait any longer to protect your online activity. Check out ExpressVPN today, and you'll find out why it's rated #1 by Business Insider and The Verge. Secure your online activity today at expressvpn.com/spiked, and you'll get an extra 3 months of ExpressVPN for free. That's expressvpn.com/spiked. expressvpn.com/spiked. So the publishers Puffin have rewritten vast amounts of Roald Dahl's classic books. Essentially, they've taken the red pen to this children's author, changed characters, words, anything that might be deemed offensive by so-called sensitivity readers. So we've learned, for instance, that Augustus Gloop from Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is no longer going to be fat. Miss Trunchbull from Matilda is no longer described as female. And the Oompa Loompas are no longer titchy and tiny, and they're gender neutral for good measure as well. Inaya, what have you made of this rewrite?
I mean, it's just, frankly, it's crazy. It's absurd. It's so dull. I mean, sensitivity readers have such a corrosive and pernicious effect on the literary industry and freedom of speech, essentially rewriting not just amazing classic works that have had huge influence over society, but actually authors now that are trying to explore different characters as well, that they are having them completely rethought in the name of sensitivity readers, a complete attack on kind of artistic and literary freedom. And as you've just described, many of those descriptions are just frankly absurd. And it just shows you not just the echo chamber and the conformity in many of these circles, that they can't see that this is something that is totally out of touch with the majority of people. And I think it's been really interesting listening to the arguments that have been put forward. Oh, it's just a commercial venture. I mean, firstly, who is demanding this? Who is asking for this? So I just think it's yet another example. And it's a more kind of joking, trivial end. But we see on one end this happening, but then on the other end, what's happening with Salman Rushdie. And the fact that there's actually a much more bloody and dangerous culture of censorship. And I do see it as part of that same culture of just a hostility to ideas.
Well, there's more than one way to burn a book, as Ray Bradbury famously said. Tom, I was going to bring on Salman Rushdie, actually, because he has expressed his outrage at this censorship. He's a man who knows what it's like to be censored.
No, definitely. And I think that was why it was, again, such a brilliant intervention. I think there was a lot of people who were slightly caught off guard by this particular act of cultural vandalism. I mean, there was, as is always the case, there's an attempt to make some justifications for it. People wouldn't want to sound like the sort of person who get booked on GB News, so they bend over backwards to say, actually, maybe it's fine for these reasons. But even amongst those sorts of people, there was still a kind of, this is a bit crazy.
Yeah, they've gone a bit far this time.
They've gone a bit far. This is a bit mad. And because it is the first thing. I mean, not only are many of the examples ridiculous, as you sort of point out, not least because Roald Dahl is fated and enjoyed because of the fact that there's a darkness to his work. There's a kind of latent malice to many of his characters, not so latent many of the time. I think he once said that he try as he might, he can't stop his characters being horrendously nasty to each other.
Yeah,
and that's part of what the appeal was. That's something which I think children in particular, despite the sort of slightly kind of costed way we tend to approach them, do enjoy that flicker of the sort of darker side of literature. And that's something that he caters to very effectively. So on the one hand, it makes no sense. Like, why would you cleanse Roald Dahl of precisely what really made him so distinctive in the first place? The other thing that makes it that bit more sinister is that in what sense, when you're taking these works and changing them hundreds of times in many cases, in some cases grafting on entirely new sentences, getting rid of entire words, like fat has gone from all of the books, apparently. You just can't use that. There's a certain point at which this is no longer his work. It's got his name on it. If you want to buy a new edition of this book, you go to his publisher, this is what they'll sell you, but in a way it's not his. And that's something which has disquieted people and should, even if they haven't necessarily got the vocabulary to express it, or they're too scared of being seen as a culture warrior for raising concerns about it.
For standing up for free speech, basically. I mean, one of the things this has highlighted is the sort of broader phenomenon of the sensitivity reader. And obviously we can know what's been changed because we've all read the old versions. We know what they're like and people have been able to make comparisons. But this screening is going on all the time, behind the scenes. We don't even know what is being cancelled before publication right now. I mean, that's terrifying, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, this case has obviously got a lot of attention, but a similar thing happened to the author Kate Clancy. Her work, and that caused a lot of controversy. And as I just mentioned, I just think that this is deeply anti-democratic. Many of oftentimes the language that is used are things they're not even using every day.
Yeah.
And I just think it's really sad. I think it's really unfortunate that this is happening, and so few people, despite the fact that there has been more disquiet over this, still there isn't that systematic pushback in the publishing industry as the guardians of literature to actually call this out.
Yeah, that's the other scary thing, isn't it? It's from within the publishing industry. The barbarians are in the gates, I think is how you described it earlier this week.
This review was initiated by the Roald Dahl story company themselves. Whilst it was still in the possession of the Dahl family, they've since sold it to Netflix, essentially. And it's something which this is all just part of the kind of the common sense of that particular industry.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that makes it so difficult to grapple with. This isn't about, in what sense can you kind of push back against that if this is just what everyone within that particular world thinks is entirely acceptable? But it obviously flows from a general sort of elite consensus, which is incredibly myopically preoccupied with the way in which words and culture warp people, as far as they can tell.
Particularly children. But
it was interesting because we often talk about how we live in an infantilized culture in which adults are treated like children. The flip side of that seems to be that children are treated like kind of robots, essentially. Is that you have to program them with the right messages at the right age. Otherwise, you don't know what kind of prejudices could curdle in their little brains. So you see this kind of preoccupation with children's literature in the form of this Roald Dahl story. And the sort of more absurd flip side of it is these new books that are written for no other reason than propaganda, effectively. Anti-racist baby, my first book of protest, feminist baby, and all this kind of other stuff.
This little Ruth Bader Ginsburg colouring books or whatever.
What's interesting, it's ridiculous. And it is dragging art and culture closer towards propaganda. That's the kind of the underlying message so much of this stuff, is that everything has to be put to work, has to say the right thing, impart the right message. But I'm also convinced it is very likely to repel children away from art and culture and literature, because it's precisely that ability to explore in some cases the slightly more dark things, the slightly more imaginative things, that actually makes it work. And when you've got a situation like in one of these edits, like in The Witches, where they've decided that they can't, where they were originally posing as cashiers in the supermarket, they have to be actually posing in plain sight as top scientists and businesswomen. You just think this is denigrating art and creativity to such an extreme extent. You even have to have like girl boss messages encoded in this. Then we've kind of lost the game in that sense.
Yeah, and it's just so bad. It's just so on the nose a lot of the time. And actually, we have seen it not just in the literature world, but also in Hollywood.
Yeah.
So many remakes have been girl boss characters and men talking about how patriarchal they are. And actually, it just completely turns off the fans.
Yeah.
And actually, oftentimes when the fans no longer watch it and complain, and they're told that they're
racist.
Exactly, and bigoted. So you kind of just think, well, what more can you do if even just people reacting against it doesn't seem to make the kinds of impacts because it's just so entrenched.
Can you believe that February is nearly over? I mean, it's the time of year when most of us start to give up on our New Year's resolutions. Sometimes it's just too hard to change your habits. But this year, one habit I've really, really been sticking with is my shaving and skincare routine. That's because having a subscription with Harry's makes it so much easier to stay looking fresh. The razors work really well. They've got a weighted handle and a 5-blade cartridge that makes shaving feel really smooth and simple. And it works even better when you use Harry's foaming shave gel. Plus, a clean shave isn't the only thing Harry's is helping me out with at the moment. Recently, I've started using Harry's brightening eye cream to try to hide the effects of all those late nights and early mornings. All of this gets delivered to me regularly thanks to Harry's subscription service. It means I never have to remember to buy new shaving gear or creams before they run out. And if I ever want to adjust or switch up my products, I can always make any changes directly from my account page. So, take it from me, with a Harry's subscription, looking my best is one resolution I know I can stick to. The best way to get started is with a Harry's trial set, which Spiked podcast listeners and viewers can now get for free. And it includes Harry's fantastic brightening eye cream to keep you looking even sharper and fresher than ever. So, make sure to support our podcast and start your own skincare journey by redeeming a free Harry's trial set. All you cover is the £3.95 for delivery. Just head to harrys.com/spiked and have your trial set and brightening eye cream delivered straight to your door. That's harrys.com/spiked. So the race is on to replace Nicola Sturgeon as SNP leader after she resigned last week. I think it's fair to say the race is a bit of a car crash so far. We've got three leading candidates. We've got Ash Reagan, the former community secretary, Hamza Yusuf, the health secretary, and Kate Forbes, the finance secretary. Tom, should we talk a bit about Kate Forbes first? Because she's been getting a lot of flack for her Christian beliefs.
No, it's really interesting, the way in which her candidacy has basically, at least in terms of how it's being talked about, it may well turn out to be true, I'm not sure, has eventually been sunk over the course of about 24, 48 hours because of the fact that the views that everyone basically knew that she already held, she chose to express them in public. So naturally, she's a evangelical Christian. She belongs to a very socially conservative Scottish church, has previously made pro-life statements, and she was essentially on maternity leave during the gender recognition row. Many people suspected that was, if not kind of orchestrated, then certainly very convenient. Because of the fact that she's obviously a high-ranking cabinet minister, but almost certainly wasn't going to vote for that legislation. During interviews this week, she made it clear that she wouldn't have. She also made clear that she wouldn't have voted for gay marriage, given the fact that she's an evangelical conservative Christian, and so believes that marriages between a man and a woman is not really a big shocker. The response, again, hasn't been surprising, but has been pretty ridiculous. Not only have you had the kind of usual kind of figures in the liberal press, so this makes her unfit to be Scottish First Minister and to lead the SNP, even some of the people who backed her. So I think in the morning after she gave some of these interviews, about 5 of the SNP figures who had actually formally backed her pulled out. Apparently, even her own campaign manager is actually going to step down at this particular point. And you just think this is so incredibly strange. First of all, because I think what we're seeing here, and we've seen other cases of this before that we might get into, is a kind of like reverse religious test now. Like if you happen to hold socially conservative religious views, it's now kind of established that should bar you from public office. People try and dress it up in different ways. She's not right to lead the SNP or whatever. But I really don't buy that, because of the fact that the reason the SNP exists is to get Scotland out of the United Kingdom. What that has to do with gay marriage, what that has to do with gender self-ID, what that has to do with children outside of wedlock makes no sense to me whatsoever. And whilst I think it's therefore quite likely that the SNP membership and faithful could turn against Kate Forbes because of all of this, I think they might be missing a bit of a trick, partly because her main competitor, Hamza Yusuf, is a clown, and we might get into that, but also because of the fact that I think people do actually like people who have the courage of their convictions, even if they don't actually share those convictions. I think this kind of treatment of her is not going to endear people to the SNP, even if they are still quite unassailable in Scottish politics.
I mean, this is just, it is intolerant, isn't it? Let's be honest. Especially as she said, she doesn't want to bring these ideas to politics.
I do think it is fair to say that, if you hold certain beliefs, in some sense, almost by definition, you'd be your politics would be shaped by that. But when people talk about unpopularity, I mean, Nicola Sturgeon, the reason for her demise was pretty much one of the most unpopular policies in the last 10 years in Scotland, trying to get male rapists into female prisons. So in the context of popularity in terms of ideas that are being pushed forward, I think they might be pretty even in that respect. But ultimately, I think it's for the SNP voters, and I think, as you rightfully mentioned, SNP is fundamentally about Scotland leaving the UK, and so it's neither a Liberal Party or a Conservative Party. It's what the particular membership at that time make it. But I think it's also just shown why the SNP has leaned so heavily into cultural issues over the last few years, whether that's green issues, trans issues, free speech, or general anti-Tory sentiment. Because beyond just the basic desire to leave the UK, there's nothing really holding them together. And so actually, it's quite hollow beyond that.
Well, clearly they don't agree on what they should do outside the UK. Essentially, you touched on the green thing. Even that has come up, which is interesting. Ash Reagan has said that she wants to delay net zero to save Scottish oil jobs. I think we should talk a bit more about Hamza Yusuf. He's health secretary at the moment. He's thought to have not done a great job running the NHS, but perhaps he's someone we'll have discussed on this podcast previously for his role in the Hate Crime Act. This is the act which essentially sends people to prison, potentially for 7 years, for stirring up hatred, in its words, including in your own home.
Yeah, to me, when we talk about the SNP as a Liberal Party, I mean, that some of the policies they've tried to forward over the last 10 years have been some of the most illiberal policies that we've seen in Europe, let alone the UK. And yeah, the hate crime bill would criminalise people talking about race issues or gender issues that didn't conform to a particular progressive orthodoxy. And he was so comfortable with that. And I think it was quite interesting, Kemi Badenoch, in a podcast interview, she said that while she doesn't agree with Kate Forbes, she respects the fact and actually quite thinks is a good thing that a politician would say what they think, and not necessarily just say what they think will forward their political career. And I think that actually Hamza Yusuf, I don't really believe a word that he says, because I don't know what reason he's saying that, because he's always just seemingly done whatever was the illiberal orthodoxy at a given time.
And he's definitely the sort of continuity Sturgeon figure, it seems. Whatever she wants, that's what has happened.
He's positioned himself as that quite explicit. I think he's even today, when we were recording this, Sturgeon all but kind of endorsed him, suggesting that whoever leads us should be, stick to our progressive agenda and so on. But it is funny, it's going back to the point you were making, Inaya, where it's like, we've got Hamza Yusuf. He was actively campaigning to criminalise dinner table conversations. He wants to continue on with this policy of letting men into women's spaces and even prisons. He's also got a dreadful record as health secretary. There's actually quite a damning report which has been out today in terms of that. He got up in the Scottish Parliament not too long ago and was decrying the fact that all these different various kind of heads of industry or the judiciary were white. I mean, Scotland's a 96% white country. Are you that shocked?
We're going to watch this clip because people need to see it.
The Lord President, white. The Lord Justice Clerk, white. Every High Court judge, white. The Lord Advocate, white. The Solicitor General, white. The Chief Constable, white. Every Deputy Chief Constable, white. Every Assistant Chief Constable, white. The Head of the Law Society, white. The Head of the Faculty of Advocates, white. Every Prison Governor, white.
That's the sane choice, the continuity.
Who's the nutcase here? The person who is religious and therefore has religious views. I mean, but this is what you end up with. But I think it's interesting.
That's another aspect, because people have not been grilling Hamza Yusuf on his religious views because he's a practicing Muslim.
But he's a good example of how it's like you're allowed to be religious in public life, as long as you are basically the sort of Lib Dem version of that religion. Not to bring Tim Farron into this, but basically, if you're religious, but you don't, as long as you're not socially conservative, it's fine.
Spiritual
is fine. Magic FM and the Chilterns, as David Cameron used to say. That's all right.
But I just think he comes across really badly. I don't know if either of you saw this, but he fell over
on his little scooter.
And he got really angry at people on social media for taking the mick out of him. I'm like, can't you even laugh at yourself? I mean, it was quite funny.
There's videos
he would have wanted the hate crime act to have been in place then, so he could lock people up.
There's videos of him arguing with nurses. And this is the other thing where you think, one doesn't want to put too much of a premium on competence in politics or whatever. But I think this again shows how deranged the SNP have become by identity politics, because you've got in the figure of Kate Forbes, she shoots to prominence because of the fact that her predecessor as finance minister quits on the day of the budget and gets loads of plaudits because of how good she was. Generally seen to be very competent in a brief and so on. Hamza Yusuf, he's a bungling idiot, essentially. But he's all right because he believes that you can become a woman, Fraser, by clicking your fingertips. That's how far things have gone in relation to this. And even with Scottish independence, it's like, again, signalling the right views and all these modish cultural stuff is more important even than having a sane leader who might be able to actually win you back some support to get Scotland out of the Union, which is supposedly what it's supposed to be about. But
well, unlucky Scotland. Sorry.
Thank you so much for watching the Spiked podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spiked's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.